we need to talk about modes. The other day, I had this sort of realization that I was being inconsistent with the way that I talked about modes. I was sort of staring off into space, and not really thinking about anything in particular, and I realized, wait a minute, I'm doing this, and this is not okay. A few weeks ago, I put up a chart that I made on the Ongaku Concept Patreon page, and it was a chart with the 7 Gregorian church modes. So we had Ionian and Dorian and Phrygian and so on. And each of those modes were listed out on C, so you could clearly compare them. And each of them had 2 examples, songs from video games that used these modes, except for Locrian. Locrian only had 1 example, because that was the only example that I could find. And I realized that there were plenty more examples that I could give, but I was being inconsistent and unfair with my judgment about what I applied the label of Locrian to. For example, All Hail Shadow by Crush 40 from Shadow the Hedgehog is a very good example of Locrian. It's in the key of B minor, and it constantly uses the flat 2 and flat 5 from the Locrian mode, but for some reason I wasn't considering it to be an example of Locrian, because it didn't use it enough for it to be based in Locrian, and that's the problem. Songs aren't based in modes or scales. It doesn't make any sense to say that. You have people who talk... Okay, so an example of this, a lot of early, beginner musicians will ask questions about songs like, what progression does this song use? What chord progression does this song use? And they learn very quickly that that's not a very practical question to ask. I'm not sure what word I'm looking for, but it's not a very sensical question to ask, because, what chord progression are you talking about? Songs will use all kinds of different chord progressions. Maybe you'll have a song that'll use just one, 4-chord progression throughout the entire thing, but a lot of songs constantly change the chord progressions that they're using throughout. And so to ask a question like that, it really has to be limited to a certain section of the song. And I think the next step on the ladder is with scales and modes. And unfortunately, this is a step that's been embraced by a lot of teachers. So you say, well, this song is in the key of F Lydian. This song is in the key of D Dorian, or whatever. And I think that is... I don't think that's a very good way of thinking about it. Because music is more fluid than that. A lot of songs, because of the nature of modes, a lot of modes cannot be used exclusively, or else you won't be able to tonicize them. So part of the reason, that Lydian is not used very often is because of its raised fourth. It's difficult to tonicize, and so if you're going to use it, you're going to need to make changes to your harmony in order to properly tonicize it. But just because a song, uses a lot of Lydian, notes in it, but not entirely, doesn't mean that it's not using Lydian. In the same way that Crush 40 song, that, maybe the tonic chord wasn't a diminished chord, but that doesn't mean that it wasn't using Locrian. And I had been roped in by the sort of teaching that is commonly given about modes, which is you can be in a mode, which doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. You can use modes. You can use modes just like you use scales, because modes are scales and scales are modes. But they don't... It's as senseless of a question to ask what mode is this song in, as it is to say what chord progression does this song have. Because music is fluid, and you don't songs will switch in and out between different modes constantly. So if you look at Cornelia from Star Fox Zero, that song is in the key of B flat minor. In the first 30 seconds, you hear Aeolian, Dorian, Phrygian. Which one is it? Is it B flat minor? Is it B flat Dorian? Is it B flat Phrygian? Are you going to specify each time those are used? It's fluid. It's constantly weaving in and out of these modes. But what is central to all of this is that all of those modes relate back to B flat minor. And I think that is where we need to be thinking. So I think part of this confusion arose out of a language issue and the way that we talk about modes and keys, the language that we use. So here in America, at least, the word for key has two different definitions in terms as it relates to music. The first definition is exactly like a key on a map or a legend on a map, which is the key signature that you see in written music. So the sharps or flats or whatever that are letting you know, henceforth, all of these notes are sharp or flat or whatever. The second definition of key is the tonal center and overall major or minor tonality. So our tonal center, so if we say a song is in the key of B flat minor, we understand two things. Number one, our tonal center, our center of gravity, is B flat, and that is the note to which all other notes are being compared. The second bit of information is that it is using a minor tonality. So we have a flat third as our primary deciding factor for the tonality of the piece, or for the modality of the piece. And from there, everything else is fair game. So you can use, so if we have a song in the key of F major, all right, we can use the F major scale, we can use Lydian, we can use Mixolydian, we can borrow from the parallel minor, none of that matters. Overall, it is F major. Until that changes, it's in the key of F major. And I think that is also, like, the use of the words major and minor is also another consideration. I think the way that we tie keys, as it refers to tonal center and major and minor modality, to scales is understandable, but we have too tight of a relationship between them. So when we say that a song is in the key of F major, we also have like the F major scale, which is going to be the default, the one that we expect to use most often, that will probably be used the most often. But just because it's not using the major scale doesn't mean that it's no longer in the key of F major. And the way that I like to think of this is like franchises in video games or whatever. So let's say for example, let's pretend that we're in a world where all Legend of Zelda games feature Zelda as the protagonist, and you play as Zelda, and that's what you do. And so let's say a game comes along, and so these are all Legend of Zelda games, right? Let's say a game comes along where you play as Link as the main character. It is still a Legend of Zelda series game, and you are playing as Link. Playing as Link means that, you're playing a completely different character from a completely different viewpoint, but it doesn't mean that it is no longer a part of the franchise. And so I sort of think of keys that way. So F major is a franchise, and every other scale that relates back to that is still part of the umbrella term of F major. Does that make sense? I think too many people and teachers, unfortunately, get this idea that because a song is not using the major scale primarily, well, it must not be in a major key. It must be Lydian or something. And you might understand at this, you might say at this point, okay, well, I understand what you are saying, but I see a use for saying, okay, well, for categorizing in this manner and saying, well, this piece is in the key of F Lydian, or at least this piece is in F Lydian, in that we're using F Lydian as our primary basis for composition here. And I can understand that, but if you're going to do that, you need to be consistent, okay? Because I doubt that the same people who would vouch for that would also say that we should do that for other scales. You know, most people don't distinguish between F minor and F harmonic minor. And you might say, well, that's just because harmonic minor is an alteration of the natural minor. But isn't that the case for everything else as well? Isn't that the case for the modes? Isn't Dorian just a minor scale with a raised sixth? When you really think about it, and you might say, so there's this mental separation that happens where we separate modes from all the other scales. We understand all these other scales are very fluid and we can use them throughout and do whatever we wish with them. But with modes, we sort of block them off and put them at a higher status and say, these are different. And that doesn't make any sense because when you really think about it, all scales are modes and all modes are scales. If E Phrygian is a mode of C Ionian, in that if you start C Ionian on a different note, it is now E Phrygian. E Phrygian is a mode of C Ionian, or C major. Then isn't C major also a mode of E Phrygian? All scales are modes of each other. All modes are, it's all the same. So it doesn't make any sense for us to do, and I understand that there are probably historical reasons why. You know, if you look back at the Catholic Church, they used to compose with various modes, and so you'd have modes like the Dorian mode, which is the same as our current Dorian mode, and you would have like the Hypodorian mode. And there was no difference between Dorian and Hypodorian in terms of tonal center or the scale degrees. It was a difference in range, and you would also focus more on one auxiliary note than another if you were to use, normal Dorian. And I think that sort of idea has extended to our understanding of modes today, and it's not really compatible. So I think we should be understanding, and you might also say, in response to what I said earlier about, well, it's hard to try and ask, what's the chord progression for this song without looking at it at very specific points, because, well, a chord progression can change quite a bit throughout a song. And I said that's also the case with scales and modes, because you can also change modes throughout a song. But you might say, well, the same is true with keys as well, because you can change keys throughout a song. And that's true, but it's a little bit different, because with keys, you have a defined focal point. And modes and scales are all elaborations on that. And so I think if we understand keys as being, here's your tonal center, here's your modality, in terms of major or minor, umbrella terms that encompass all the other modes that use those, then I think that is the best place to start. And there's nothing there's nothing wrong with scales. There's nothing wrong with scales, there's nothing wrong with modes. I don't like the focus and the importance and the weight with which they are discussed. I think that we take them too seriously, but I understand that they are organizational tools, and they're very useful ones, because they're very good when you need to understand, I want to use a linear pattern of some sort for this bit. It's good to have a scale to pull from when you want to get a certain sound or work over a certain chord, and you need something linear, a pattern of notes that you can just play without thinking. And so there's a use for that. But Guthrie Govan has a very good video where he talks about modes, and he's saying, stuff like, here's our tonal center. Now let me play a minor chord. And now I can play all this kind of stuff and go from here to here to here and go through all these other modes, and it all works, it all fits. And now let me change this to a major modality, or let me change the tonal center. Now I have to reevaluate what I'm doing. And his point was that music is very, very fluid. And And I think trying to identify entire songs by what scales they use limits this understanding. So I think it's okay to talk about scales and modes and say, well, this is primarily using this mode or whatever. But I think it is a waste of time and unnecessarily limiting and unnecessarily confusing to people who are learning to try and talk about songs as though they are in a mode. I think it's much more important to focus on the key. So, let me know what you guys think. I will be doing a video on, to explain exactly what modes are and how they work, because I know that a lot of you guys have trouble understanding that sort of thing, and I really hate the way that they're taught. And so I'll get into that at some point, but for right now, I just wanted to bring up an issue that I felt was prevalent with music education and needed to be addressed. This episode was made possible by the generous support of my patrons. If you want access to sheet music used in these episodes, extra resources, and follow-up videos, you can check out my Patreon at patreon.com/ongakuconcept. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.